Hello, and welcome to Elevating Voices for Long Lasting Change. I'm your host, Vic Armstrong, and I want to thank you all for joining me today on this journey. Our focus today is on suicide prevention in the deaf and hard of hearing community. I'm joined by Jada Johnson, a deaf mom born and raised in Minnesota, who lost her 23-year-old son Shay to suicide in November of 2016. We're also joined by Tara Grimenos, an American Sign Language interpreter and suicide prevention educator. She also was born and raised in Minnesota and lost her 18-year-old brother Logan to suicide in March of 2017. Thank you both for joining me today.
I was saying thank you for hosting this, Vic. And Jade is agreeing. Thank you for having us here today.
Thank you so much. I would love to start by having each of you share a little bit about your story. And I'd love to start with you, Jada, if you don't mind. Tell us a little bit about your story and what brings you to this space today to share about your experience.
Well, I'm Jada Johnson. I am deaf. I live here in Minnesota, and my story is about my oldest son, Jason Shay McKenzie, who passed away in 2016, November. He was 23. I wish that nobody would have to go through what I did. It was heartbreaking, the grief that I experienced, where I knew something was up because we have a traditional Sunday dinner. And so I went to Shay's house. And when I got there, he was renting a room near the University of Minnesota at that time. And when I got there, I thought he was asleep. But when I touched him, his body was cold and it undid me. He was gone. And I just lost it. I didn't know how to get help. I didn't know what to do. Eventually the police arrived, and not just like one or two, but like suddenly there was a whole group of 8 or 9 police officers in the room. And I said, I need an interpreter. I'm deaf. And I kept asking them to provide an interpreter for me, and they just ignored me. And like part of my world went with my son. I didn't know what was happening. It was awful. And the police asked me if I would communicate with them by writing. I was in such a vulnerable state and I wasn't clear-headed and I wasn't able to communicate. Not even my writing was legible. I was just so shaken. And just not only the death of my son, but the barriers that I faced. Just trying to navigate communication rather than focusing on the fact that my son is not here any longer. And I remember once they were wheeling his body away, because Shay and I were very close and very interactive, I felt like I learned a lot more after the autopsy was complete. And it was a thick report, and it was full of medical language that was really dense and was really difficult for me to just follow and understand what had happened to my son. And the question was, what happened that night when he ended his life, when he died by suicide? My other 2 younger children, my daughter was 12 at the time, and my son was 11. And at those ages, it's hard to describe to them, your brother is gone. Both of my kids can sign. They both can hear. We call them CODAs, children of deaf adults. But trying to find the language to describe the situation to these preteens that their brother is no longer with us. My daughter understood it and immediately broke down into tears, but my son was resistant and said, no, we're going to watch the Vikings together. And I ended up getting us into family therapy. And I had a one-on-one therapist who could sign. But for family therapy, my children each had their own therapist. And my daughter was able to share her experience with the therapist and get some help. But my son was really resistant. And he said, my brother and I have a pact that if I need to talk to somebody, I talk to him and I don't talk to anybody else. And so he wasn't willing to do much in therapy. My daughter now is 21, my son is 20, and I've watched their journey. I've watched them grow since that happened. They've become more open. They've sought out therapy. Yeah. What else can I tell you? I just want to emphasize that if you lose somebody to suicide, you need support. Get get yourself a therapist, find a support group. And that took me a really long time to find a support group because I'm deaf and there aren't support groups in ASL, not many of them anyway. And so I did a lot of searching and I got a letter from the police department that talked about murder, and that was confusing and it's not what happened. And so it was very difficult finding the support I need. I went to some non-deaf support groups. They were okay. But I finally, thanks to Tara, actually found and helped found a group of support in ASL for deaf survivors of suicide survivors like myself, people who have been there and who understand the journey that we've been on. And not only that, but we have access to one another. So I feel like every time I'm doing something about this, I have to educate by asking for an interpreter and then describing what an interpreter does. And just to get my needs met when I just need to grieve. I just need to sit down, like for the interview, the police interview, the forensic interview, even the funeral home. They were like, well, why can't we just have one interpreter? Why do we need two? But my best friend is deaf and blind, and they require a special type of sign language that's done in the hand, like Helen Keller. And so we needed a second separate interpreter, and just all of the education that I had to do to try and break down those barriers just to get my needs met. I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of my experience to this point.
Jada, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I am so sorry for your loss, but I appreciate you being willing to share that with us. And we'll come back to that because I really want to touch on a couple of very important things that you shared there. I do want to now move to Tara, though. Tara, tell us, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your story, your journey.
Sure. Thank you. I've been working as an ASL interpreter for almost 20 years now. I was born and raised in Minnesota. My youngest brother of the five of us, Logan, he was 18 at the time that he ended his life. He was a senior in high school, and this was in 2017. And I'm from a small, wealthy suburb where mental health and suicide aren't things that we talk about. They don't come up much. And he passed away 2 months before he graduated from high school, and my entire world was turned upside down. Like Jada, I totally didn't know what to do. And so part of my journey was to try and figure out why. Why had this happened? Why did it happen to him? Why does it happen to other people? And so for the last now 8 years, I guess, I've been looking into just really delving into suicide research, learning everything that I can about it. And also, it impacted both my worlds, the deaf community world that I interpret in and have friends in and socialize in, and the suicide community too, because there is no access to suicide prevention, suicide support in the deaf community. And so for the last number of years, it's been my work to bridge the gap between those two communities, the suicide community, suicide survivor community, and the deaf community. And fortunately, we were able to set up a deaf suicide support group this past October. We meet on Zoom, and I'm thrilled to be able to be a part of providing access for this support group where people can sign with one another. But yeah, my work the last 8 years has been in uniting the deaf and interpreting communities with the suicide survivor community by providing workshops, interpreting services, education, and the like. And it's given me I don't know. I feel like it's my duty to honor my little brother. As his older sister, I'm going to continue to carry the flame for him and honor him in what I do.
Thank you so much. And also, again, I'm sorry for your loss, but thank you so much for sharing your story as well. One of the things that strikes me, and I think it probably always resonates with me in part because of the work that I do in the equity space, but intersectionality and how different worlds can overlap for people is always something that is interesting to me. And when I listen to both of you, and Tara, you talk specifically about being from a community that did not talk about suicide, but I also recognize you're both from Minnesota. Minnesota is kind of a place where you're supposed to be hardy people. It's kind of that blue collar kind of community. And a lot of times in communities like that, and in those Midwestern type communities, there is often an additional stigma around suicide. So you've got not just the challenges you face with being deaf, but also the challenges around being in a community that does not really embrace the conversation of suicide. And so I can imagine that would also pose an additional challenge. Is that something you both have experienced?
This is Tara. Yeah, my short answer is yes. I would say I definitely agree with that. And I didn't find a lot of people who were even willing to have those hard conversations with me, talking about suicide. And because I was struggling and I didn't know what to do with these feelings and I didn't know how to talk about the hard things. And then trying to find people who would have those conversations with me because they're not easy conversations to have, especially in Minnesota. And yeah, I did struggle with that a little bit. This is Jada. I agree. Yeah, I agree with what Tara just said. For me, it depended on who the person was as to what I could say to them because sometimes people reacted with real discomfort, but I'm sorry, it's my story. This is my journey. This is where I'm at. I need to talk about my son, and I'm going to talk about my son with my kids, my family, with others. But friends in the community seemed to shy away from it and tried to avoid it. And to me, it was like, no, it's okay. We can talk about it. But other people weren't comfortable talking about it. And even within my own family, none of us had experienced this before. And so, like, when I called the pastor, they wanted to read the Bible.
Mm.
And okay, I'm okay to talk about this, though. And again, it really comes down to the individual and their own reaction.
Yeah, I think again, so much of what you say resonates with me because a lot of what you talk about, there are things that are inherent to the suicide space that oftentimes people don't want to talk about it, don't know how to talk about it. But you also shared a couple of things that are very different and unique to your situation because, Jada, you talked about the reaction of law enforcement when they came to your home. And I can only imagine when you're already in a state of shock and grief and disbelief and have all of those emotions flowing through you, and then you have law enforcement who's maybe not prepared to even be able to communicate with you. So again, that adds an additional strain. Can you talk a little bit about the additional challenges of being deaf and hard of hearing and having to communicate with first responders and what that experience was like?
Yeah, this is Jada. So, in that moment, it was like everybody was there in the room looking at me in my space, and I felt threatened and because they couldn't communicate with me, and I just kept asking for an interpreter, and they wouldn't provide one. And I did feel an increasing anxiety, like somehow I had done something wrong and was going to be punished. Um, but then eventually my nephew arrived, and when I saw a familiar face, I was that helped me reground myself a little bit, and I could actually like communicate with lip reading because, like I said, I was totally out of my body at that point, and it wasn't until I saw my nephew who I recognized that he was able to tell me that. The medical examiner wants to harvest Shay's organs, and I was lip reading to understand that, and I was just like, I mean, what do I say? I don't know what to say to that. Um, and for me, the barriers kept increasing to the point where I couldn't respond. There was no response, and it affected me to the point where um like I couldn't answer. I needed help and I didn't know how to get it, and I was lost. Just lost, which is why it's important that first responders know about deaf people and have some sort of cultural training so that if they encounter a deaf or hard of hearing person that they have protocol in place, that they don't just ignore the person's need because they're difficult to communicate with, but rather they provide the accommodations that are needed so they can communicate.
One of the things that I became,
Yeah, I think. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Jade. I'm sorry.
No, I think I was done.
Yeah. One of the things that I became acutely aware of as we were preparing for this conversation is that we oftentimes don't think about individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. And we don't have those things always built into the way that we respond and react and the way that we provide services and resources to communities. And so, I have to, even in my space, I've got to go back now and look at the way that I do things and think about the things I could do differently. One of the things, Jada, that really resonated with me when you shared your story is that because of the things that were going on around you in having to navigate the conversation with law enforcement, that you didn't really even have the opportunity to focus on the fact that your son was no longer here. And that is heartbreaking. But again, it's one of those things that we often in the hearing community don't think about. And I would imagine that for a law enforcement officer, the last thing they want is to cause you more pain, to cause you more grief, but they don't have the resources to address you at your point of need, and that's got to be very difficult. Tara, do you have any similar experiences with first responders?
So, this is Tara. My primary work is as an interpreter, and actually, I work in the legal arena a lot. So, I work in courts, I work with the police often in a variety of situations. So, I'm very familiar with what they have as well as what they need. And yeah, it's definitely there are gaps. And what I often hear from deaf suicide survivors, from our support group, from lost survivors, because we hear the same stories over and over. The deaf survivors often talk about having to focus on their own communication needs rather than their grieving or the person who they just lost. That doesn't happen until later. And I often hear their grief ends up being delayed as a result of having to focus on just getting access to the situation, to knowing like, oh, is there going to be an autopsy? I'll get a report. Can I have an interpreter for the funeral? Can I have an interpreter in the hospital? Grief has to be put on hold until some point in the future. And that's not fair. It's just not fair. As a person who can hear, I have access to the environment around me. I can go to a support group. I can go to the funeral and participate. I can start grieving the day it happens. Deaf people don't have that, I don't know, luxury is the word I guess we have to use. They don't get to grieve in the moment, and that's not fair. It's not right.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind for me is that we often, I think, have privileges that we're not aware of. And, the fact that services are designed for hearing people is a privilege that I enjoy that we often don't think about, that other people don't necessarily get to enjoy that privilege. From your perspective, and I pose this question to both of you, what would make access to emergency services, first responder services, more accessible for people who are deaf?
This is Jada. Oh, hmm. I would say again, it's coming down to education to the first responders. Somebody coming in and providing deaf cultural training, not just once, but ongoing. If they're in a community that has deaf people or other people with disabilities, they need to know how to interact with them. And I have complained several times. I've offered trainings, and it doesn't have to be me. It can be somebody else who like is knowledgeable. And I would say occasionally, but very rarely, do any officers know any sort of sign language.
Mm.
But it would be nice in those situations to have an officer or two who at least could sign rudimentary so I could have the barest of access to the situation, but they don't ever work in a place that's conducive to that. So how to increase access? It comes down to education for me. Just making sure that people understand. This is Tara, and I would say um, the first responders need to know how to reach out to interpreters in the moment, because like Jada was saying, she had an entire platoon of police officers in the room with her, but nobody seemed to know how to get an interpreter on site. So if the police knew how to get interpreting services, whether in person or, I mean, at the minimum on a phone or on an iPad, until an interpreter can arrive in person, because that's going to be better. And again, whether that's arrival at the house or at the hospital or wherever it ends up being, an on-site interpreter is always going to be best. But I've heard so many stories where deaf survivors don't learn about the person's death um, until they're presented with a little piece of paper that they have to write. It says, "Your son is dead,"
Mm.
or something like that. And I mean, it's enraging, honestly. If the police would just have access to contracts with the agencies or knew how to reach out to those agencies, they could get interpreting services on site and it would be so beneficial. This is Jada again. I totally agree with everything Tara just said. And it reminds me that when I found Shay's body, um, we finally were able to reach out to 911, and we found out that dispatch received the message that they needed an interpreter, but then canceled it for some reason. And I'm still left puzzled over that. I said I needed an interpreter, so why was that request canceled? And so I would say it starts with dispatch, maybe, um, because who gave them permission to cancel the interpreter request, and where does that line of responsibility happen? Is it with dispatch? Is it with the police? And so again, it's good to have resources and know how to reach out, but again, I want to bring it back to training.
Mm.
If there's a request in place, leave it be. Do not cancel it.
Yeah, and I thank you both for that. And I know that when I talk with folks about even for hearing folks accessing emergency services, I will often tell them, when you contact dispatch, or when you dial 911 or 988 or whatever you're dialing, if law enforcement is going to be dispatched, I will tell them to ask for a law enforcement officer who's been trained in dealing with someone who's experiencing a mental health emergency. And I'm not sure if that's even an option in a lot of communities for someone who can sign or someone who can interpret, because I know in rural communities their resources are going to be very limited. So it does sound like this is very problematic. But do you know if there are resources like where an officer could have someone having an iPad with someone online, things like that on the scene that he can have with him to actually communicate. Have you seen those kinds of resources?
This is Tara. Yes. If the first responders, whoever they end up being, if they do some pre-work, then they can find the interpreting agency that's been contracted with. And if it hasn't been contracted with, they can make sure to like push the right buttons to make that happen. And then they call that agency.
Mhm.
The agency will send an interpreter. And in the interim, they can use an iPad, they can use FaceTime. You can have an interpreter on a mobile device while the on site interpreter is in transit. That's best practice, but it requires, again, that pre work. It can't happen in the moment. If you wait until the emergent situation, it's too late.
Right.
The contract has to be in place with the agency, and they have to know, and they have to have the iPad. So, again, it's a matter of training of best practices.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious, are there any specific strategies for recognizing the warning signs of suicidal thinking for a deaf individual that might be different for a hearing person? Do you look for anything different? Are there different signs and um, uh, uh, things that may let you know that someone is experiencing suicidal desperation?
This is Tara. I can briefly respond to that. I would say, in the big picture, there are gaps. We don't have any data on the number of deaf people who die by suicide. We don't know how many deaf loss survivors there are out there. We don't know how many deaf people have attempted suicide. We don't know because the death certificate never mentions whether or not a person is deaf. And so when somebody dies by suicide, we don't know whether they're deaf or not, which means in the big picture, it's hard to gather the data that we need to see what this situation really looks like in the lives of deaf people. When a person shows up at the hospital after a suicide attempt, are they being documented as being deaf in the system? Again, we don't know. We don't have that data. So it's a big picture problem that we need to deal with.
Do you know if is 988 accessible to a deaf person?
Yes, there is this star. They have a Def 988. Jada, do you want to talk about that or do you want me to? Jada said, Tar, will you please talk about that? Tar saying yes. So Def Lead is the name of the organization, and they are hosting um, uh, a specialty line on 988 that goes directly to video phones. So
Mhm.
you access it by going to the website. And on the front page of the 988 website, there's a button that says deaf or hard of hearing. You click on that, and it opens up a window that will connect you to a deaf crisis counselor in under 20 seconds. It's important. And so then they will process the call. It will all be done in American Sign Language. And so it's great. The resource just came online in September of 2023, which means it's little over maybe about a year and a half, year and 8 months now. So it's a really, really fantastic resource that we have.
Is there anything that to this point that I have not asked you? Oh, wait a minute. Before I go there, I do have one other question I want to ask you because I am really curious in hearing more about your support group. Can you talk a little bit about how it came about and then really how do people access it? Does it exist in different communities? I'd love to hear more about your support group.
This is Tara. Yeah, I can talk about the founding of the group, but then I want Jada to talk about her experience being in groups that were not deaf friendly versus being in an all signing group, because that's really powerful.
Mm.
Um, Oftentimes, support groups for people who can hear are just run by volunteers, and so there's no money to pay for interpreting services. I have been trained under AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And I've taken the suicide bereavement support training, just getting the interpreter up to speed there, as well as two other deaf survivors who took that training with me. And so the three of us are able to now provide Zoom meetings on a monthly basis, Sunday nights, once a month. Again, we meet virtually via Zoom. And currently we have 40 people who have signed up, all of whom are deaf. And we probably have anywhere from 10-ish or so people who show up regularly every month, but everybody has a different experience. They all use American Sign Language, so we don't need interpreting services or anything like that. And just like all the other support groups, they're led by volunteers, and it's really powerful. Jada, can you talk about your experience in this group versus the other ones? Yes, this is Jada. So I went to non-deaf groups at first, and that was interesting because at first I joined support groups online, and I never quite felt a part of the group. Felt like I was trying to fit. And at the same time, I wasn't very interactive. Everybody was talking over one another, and so it was really hard for me to just follow what was going on. And we had interpreting sometimes, but it was still difficult for me to feel the emotion and to feel like things resonated with me, but it wasn't clicking for me. And so I was like, yeah, this is very sad and all of these things, and yet I'm just not fitting in it. I tried support groups in person with, again, non-deaf groups, but it was awkward. I was new in the group. I didn't feel completely connected to them. And I know how to interact with people who aren't deaf. I know what it's like to be in an all-hearing environment, if you will. And I had interpreting services, but still, there was something missing. When I joined the deaf support group where everybody uses American Sign Language, I felt an instant connection because I was able to resonate with their experiences and I had shared those experiences. And it was instantaneous in that group. We meet on a monthly basis, and sometimes there are different people who are there. We honor people who have passed on their anniversaries, and we take a moment of silence, and the person is able to talk about what it's like now that the person's gone. And there's a real camaraderie that we have because we're all deaf and we've all been through this awful situation. And I am not somebody who likes to share. I'm very reserved, but in this group, I found myself opening up and talking about the things I needed to talk about. Was never able to do that in the other groups. And so this group is so precious to me. I can't speak highly enough of it.
Well, thank you both so much for doing that, creating the support group. Because one of the things I know, even for myself as a person of color, I know oftentimes we can encounter resources that are not designed necessarily for us, and it's difficult sometimes for us to see ourselves in those resources. And so the fact that you created a resource for the deaf community, I think is just fantastic. You also talked a couple of times about needing services in a specific situation. Like Jada, you talked about at the funeral needing two interpreters. When those situations arise, is there funding to pay for that? Does insurance pay for that? How do you pay for those interpreters?
This is Jada. I remember sitting with my oldest son's father, and there was an interpreter there and the funeral director, and having the conversation and being asked all of these questions. They were all yes, no questions. And honestly, I don't know how to plan for a funeral. It's not the type of thing I thought I was going to have to be doing just yet. And so I was unprepared for the questions. And I said, okay, well, I know that I need interpreters for the funeral service. And I got that look of what? So I had to explain all the things. And then they were like, oh, well, the insurance pay for it. And why do you need two? And I'm like, okay, so access is important to us. And The interpreter needs clarification, sorry. And so in the course of the conversation, every time I see that interpreter in the deaf community, I thank her again. I'm so grateful for her because that interpreter was willing to give up her pay to cover the second interpreter because they wouldn't cover the second interpreter. The funeral director was very number focused. And so that original interpreter said, you know what, I don't need to be paid for this. I will donate my services so that the other interpreter for my best friend who is deaf and blind who needs special services can get those services. And so we ended up getting two interpreters for the price of one, but that's only because she gave up her pay, and I'm so eternally grateful to her for that.
Well, I am eternally grateful to both of you, all three of you, for being here with us today. And, in large part, I'm grateful for you taking time to educate me. There's so much that I need to learn, that I need to know so that I can be a better advocate for the deaf and hard of hearing community. And on that note, Tara, I want to thank you because I know you do a lot of work with our AFSP chapters on training us in and interpreting for us, but also educating us on how to work with the deaf and hard of hearing community. And I'm so appreciative of that because we want everyone to feel a sense of belonging. And when people don't see themselves in the resources, or don't feel like the resources are designed for them, what it says to them is you're not a target audience. And we never want anyone to feel like that, especially in the moment that we're in now when so many people feel like they need hope and they need social connection. So thank you. Thank you both for being here, for all that you do. As we begin to wrap this up, I do want to ask you both if there's anything that you would have us to know, perhaps a question I have not asked you today or a thought that you want to leave with us as we wrap up. Jada, let's start with you.
Oh, well. Let me look at my notes really quick.
Let me ask you this while you're looking at your notes, because
I think we've covered everything. I talked about my experience. Go ahead, Vic. What was your question?
yeah, my question is when we're talking about support and resources, I'm assuming that your support group is for adults. Is there support out there for youth who are deaf, who may be either suicide loss survivors or suicide attempt survivors?
This is Jada. Every support group that I'm aware of is for 18 and over. If there are resources out there for youth, I am unaware of them. I can imagine that likely if there is such a thing, maybe a therapist would know of a support group within their locale, but I don't have any sort of specifics about that. Yeah. This is Tara. In terms of deaf only support groups, they're all adults. But I know that AFSP provides bereavement training to provide support groups for young people. So that's sort of the next step for us, is to start looking for somebody in the current group who might be interested in taking that training to then provide those resources for somebody who is under 18. Because yeah, I think that would be great.
Yeah, fantastic. And Tara, any parting thoughts?
I think I want us to think outside the box and to think of people who aren't like us. Caption your videos with real captions done by a person, a live person, not YouTube's awful auto captions. Reach out to the deaf community, and when you offer training, workshops on suicide prevention, educational webinars, and the like, find interpreters. Reach out to the deaf community to see whether or not there's interest. And if you build it, they will come. If there's interest, provide interpreters. And then when there is access, people will take you up on that access. And Jada said, absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been fantastic. I so appreciate you taking time to have this conversation with me today. So, Jada, Tara, I cannot express my gratitude enough. For everyone who joined us today, who tuned in, thank you for being with us today for this episode of Elevating Voices. Um, I do want to leave this thought with anyone who's listening today, and that is that you understand that you matter. Your life matters. Your pain matters. And above everything else, we want to make sure that you will be here tomorrow and every day after that. Thank you so much for being with us.